Today's topic is important because it's a hot topic in the fire service. The reason being is because the way we train people will absolutely affect the outcome of our service deliverables. Now, if we train people improperly or we don't have the right mindset going into training, oftentimes that training will create training scars as well as failures on the incident scene. What I mean by improper training is if we train people to an algorithm, meaning a step-by-step process or a checkbox process, or we train people in an environment that's too sterile or has negative connotations, it can be very counterproductive. And in fact, it can be as counterproductive as it is, unfortunately, traditional. So for today's presentation, we're going to talk about the attitude. Not only the attitude of the firefighter, but the attitude of the training ground. We're going to talk about the boundaries of the human brain because it most certainly affects how we perform. We'll talk about human performance as it applies to training as well as execution. We'll talk about training execution, how we deliver the training that we have made. Then lastly, we'll talk about safety, which is always a very important topic. And as I said before, this has become a hot topic because no matter how infrequently train or how simple, the concepts of how we deliver that training can be detrimental or it can be very effective in how we train our firefighters. Let me wrap this up by saying that the material in this presentation is as relevant to the largest organization as it is to the smallest. So what motivates you? What motivates you as a firefighter? What motivates you as a training officer or chief officer of your organization? Attitude is the most important thing in the fire service, and it's often said the positive attitude is the most important aspect of a successful firefighter. We have varying levels of attitude in the fire service. We have anything from the salty veteran who knows it all, or we have everything down to the green stick rookie who wants nothing more than to soak up any knowledge they can. How we deliver our training, and when I say how we deliver our training, I'm not necessarily referring to as a training officer of the train division, but this could be a company level too. Anybody who's got a fire instructor level 1, this applies to. When we do training, if that training is negative, it will affect all future trainings because the person who participated in that training will view training as negative or will view our program or your crew's program as irrelevant. But most importantly, there's something we can take from every training. You often hear firefighters leave a class and go, "Oh, that was a waste of time," or "Oh, I didn't learn anything." Now, as boring as content may be, or as irrelevant, we can always find at least one gold nugget to take out of any training presentation and apply it to ourselves, our career, or our department. Now, training should absolutely be led by requirement. Now, it might be a directive by the fire chief, or it might be as simple as, a state certified board who sets minimum requirement hours or topics. But training should also be led by the line. It should be the line who brings that information up and says, "Hey, this is where we feel like we're short in." Now, that feedback should come from anywhere from the firefighter to the company officer. Now, when we take information for training from state requirement or organizational requirement to line feedback, that can create a happy marriage in training that produces far greater yields. And what we'll be talking about in the remainder of this presentation are to find ways to make your training more motivating and useful. So while talking about what motivates you, there are several different factors of motivation. Now, it could be safety related, it could be money related. But if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the top is self-actualization. Now, I know that's kind of a big word for the fire service and something we don't often talk about, but self-actualization is realizing personal potential. It's finding self-fulfillment and seeking personal growth and peak performance. And why this is important is because we should all strive for self-actualization. We should all find areas of our needed improvement and find ways to fulfill that. Instead, oftentimes what we do is we find the path of least resistance, or we try to hide our failures and overcompensate in a way that makes us look like we're stronger than what we are. Now, that will ultimately affect us when that service deliverable happens, and we are unable to necessarily execute the task or the objective we've been handed. So what we need to do is we need to find ways to improve personal and organizational growth. Without self-actualization, training is designed upon perception requirement, which is not beneficial for anyone. Now, what I mean by training is based upon perception requirement, we talked about state or department requirements just a little bit ago. However, when we design our training upon perception, it's often hard, especially as a training officer, to find ways to train the line from a desk. Because ultimately, it's the people running the calls who know what they need the most. Now, when using this big word, self-actualization, what we really mean is just training should be designed to motivate the user instead of just trying to fulfill minimum requirements. Now we're going to talk about imagination play, also known as visualization. Now, visualization works very well for professional athletes, the military, and other groups of people. It can be very beneficial if done correctly. However, if done incorrectly, in the incorrect setting, it can be very negative to the user and create training scars. Now, visualization works really good in a sterile environment. I can do that from home, sitting in my recliner, I can close my eyes and I can think about a structure fire. I can think about my first in actions, donning my PPE, looking, doing a 360. I can take imagination play or visualization as far as I want in that sterile environment. However, when conducting scenarios, imagination play can cloud a user's experience. The reason being is that we require senses for us to be able to better understand the environment that we're in. Now, if it's the heat on our ears or on our, that we can feel radiating off of our turnouts, if it's low visibility due to smoke, all of these things are very important for how we make decisions. And oftentimes, trainers will put a firefighter or somebody into an environment and say, okay, hey, in this situation, you got to close your eyes because let's pretend you can't see. And now you have a firefighter in full PPE crawling on their hands and knees with their eyes closed, trying to experience something. Now, what we don't realize that we're doing is we're creating this false neural pathway. So this person is going to take this experience and apply it to the real thing. And what we've seen is firefighters in a real fire, or even with just low visibility, closing their eyes because this is the way they were trained to do it. Now, as unbelievable as this may sound, it really does occur. And you can ask firefighters on their experiences, and everybody knows somebody that this happened to. And it could be as simple as somebody closing their eyes because they think they can't see, because they were trained that way. But most oftentimes, it's because somebody's forgotten a tool, because on a training ground, some instructor had told them, no, you can't use this tool, or that tool's out of play for this drill. As trainers, we can use visualization in a classroom or in a sterile environment. However, we can't necessarily mix it into a practical application. Another area that we struggle with in the fire service is proper sequencing. Now, what happens is that people oftentimes when they're unveiling a training, they want to come out of the gate just way too strong. What we need is a methodical delivery of how we take a training based on the individual and apply that to them so it makes sense and that we have trained them in the proper way and minimize training scars. Now, everyone's training is different. It's going to be different from a rookie to a 15-year veteran with your organization. So the sequencing is going to change. So what is sequencing? Sequencing is being able to say, okay, from this person, start to finish, this is the proper methodical way to train the individual. Now, if it's from a rookie, that sequencing is going to be very slow at first, and we're going to speed up a little bit, and then we're going to go into a full scenario. Now, if it's to a veteran firefighter, we can easily say, on this drill, or scenario, we're doing a structure fire. Your company arrives, ready, go. That's appropriate. Now, what we do is we take that mindset and we often apply it to the rookie or even to a veteran on a new topic and expect them to be successful. Oftentimes, even for that veteran, we do have to keep in that crawl, walk, run theory. Now, for a rookie, this makes complete sense. Or if your department is going and taking on a new program like active shooter or hazmat or technical rescue, you need to slowly walk people through these things. Crawl at first, then take them to a walking speed, then later do your full scenarios. When we come out and we expect people to be more competent in what they are, we create these training scars, we create these false neural pathways, and more importantly, we decrease training morale because people feel like they were set up for failure. Now, the worst part of all this is from the trainer's perspective. What we do is we create these scenarios and we plan out in our heads how we think this should occur. Now, if we don't do it in a proper methodical way, we open that individual or that crew up to failures. Now, this opens up the idea of armchair quarterbacking, which really kind of needs to go away in our industry, because all we're doing is we're taking from our sterile perspective ideas or thoughts that we think should have occurred. However, we did not sense or experience the situation that allowed the individual or the fire company to make the decision that they did. Now, the benefit of realism cannot be understated. The only area that this does not apply is that if doing a walkthrough, or if we're like, let's say we're working on technique and we really want to focus on that technique. Let's say that technique is as simple as doing, saw placement on commercial or residential ventilation. We may only want to use the minimum required PPE to be safe. That could be just eye protection, gloves, and then bottom turnout pants, whatever your department standard is. Now, if we're doing a scenario or exercise, we want to train as your life depends on it. You want all the required PPE you would be using in that environment. Now, the reason being is because our brain will revert back to previous experience, and it wants to see that realism and apply it to future experiences. So, as trainers, we want to provide all the sensory inputs that you can. So, going back to the previous slide, if we're focusing on decreased visibility, instead of telling somebody that you can't see, we have to provide that input. Now, that could either be through a party smoke machine or a fog machine, or it could be as simple as going to the grocery store, picking up a little bit of press and seal, and putting over that mask so it creates this obscured vision. Those are the sensory inputs we have to do. We struggle on some of the areas, for example, heat, because we can't really create an IDLH environment without actually putting somebody in a fire. However, with heat, there are lots of good props out there. You have the mobile fire training units, you have the Connex burn boxes, you have the flashover trailers, and on top of that, you have the 1403 live fire acquired structures that we can do. However, even with all of those, it's really hard to provide all the sensory inputs that a firefighter normally sees. Because even though with the acquired structures, you have elevated heat, your visibility is quite a bit different. So to bypass this, we have to inform the individuals that we're training that they're not going to see this. That way their brain understands in the future, it won't be like this. Now, if you're a small volunteer department or your organization just doesn't have the resources for some of those mobile fire training units or acquired structures, it's important that you apply as many of the sensory inputs that you can do within the proper context. And that way, when that person goes into the real environment, they'll have just about everything they need to do to allow their brain to cognitively function the way it should. Now, even if you're a small volunteer department, you can probably apply a lot of these things more than you think you can. And it's very easy to create Connex burn boxes for very low cost. Now, trainers will often not induce realism, either one, because tradition, it wasn't the way they were trained, could be the lack of resources, and also could be the path of least resistance. What's the easiest way for me to conduct this training with the least amount of work to me? However, I can promise you that by looking at all the variables and trying to provide all the sensory inputs you can, the training will be perceived to be a lot more beneficial, and the training morale of your organization will greatly improve. So now we're going to talk about the amygdala. Now, I warn you, right? This is going to get a little bit nerdy. Even when I talk about this in my department, I have people who look at me like, oh, geez. Now, the amygdala is as sciencey as this gets. We should be thinking about how the amygdala applies to training because it absolutely affects human performance. And if we haven't designed our training around that, we're setting our firefighters up for failure. So it's very important to have just a baseline understanding of what the amygdala is and what it does. Now, the amygdala is responsible for that thing that we call fight or flight. We all talk about it in the fire service, but we don't talk about what causes it. Now, the amygdala and what causes that fight or flight response can be generated by three different things, either psychological, physiological, or environmental. All three of those things apply to very stressful parts of our occupation. Now, when an individual experiences one of these three stressors, what happens is that amygdala, a walnut-sized part in the center of your brain, starts to ramp up and starts releasing chemicals. Now, when those chemicals are released, two things happen. One, it notifies your cerebellum, the back part of your brain, that's responsible for a lot of our primitive actions like breathing. Then the other thing that happens is we start looking at our frontal cortex for slides of experiences that you have encountered before. So as your brain looks for those slides, right? Those slides are experiences. And they're experiences that you're trying to relate to the situation you're in now. If you cannot find something, your brain just keeps going through things. And so that's why you either fight or you flight. Now, if you fight, you're going to try to find something that is equivalent to that experience. Now, if it's improper training, such as I'm going to have you close your eyes while you do this crawl, that's what you're going to do. So realistically, when we see these training errors, they are coming from one of two places. Either one, we've improperly trained people, or two, they don't know how to act or behave with the stimulated amygdala. So if we can find ways to stimulate the amygdala, it is the greatest way we can train. So by stimulating the amygdala, what we're doing is we're providing an individual with an experience that creates that slide, that full fidelity training experience that will better their improvement in the future. In a few more minutes, we'll talk about how to stimulate the amygdala in a practical environment. So task fixation, otherwise known as lack of situational awareness or the absence of situational awareness. This has all happened to us and we've all seen it happen. Matter of fact, we armchair quarterback the person who it happens to all the time in the fire service. Now, all of this is occurring because that amygdala was stimulated. And now we're not used to dealing with that stimulated amygdala in that environment. Now, what's occurring with task fixation is that we start focusing on that perceived threat. Now, that perceived threat could be somebody with a gun pointed at us, but it also could be a weird fire that we've never experienced in a room and contents, or it could be a victim on a low-angle rope rescue attempt. Then our mind starts to shut off the periphery. We stop focusing on the other things that we should be paying attention to. For example, sounds, feelings. It could be as simple as a person working next to us through simultaneous action. And then we start limiting our pattern recognition. And this is where you start seeing a situational awareness failure, is because we became task fixated due to that stimulated amygdala. Our goal in training is to reduce task fixation, otherwise known as increasing situational awareness. Now, all of us out there, everybody can agree that we need to increase situational awareness, as well as task fixation. Well, how we do that is we have to shift our center focus. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we talk about the stimulated amygdala and how to execute training. Now, both professionally and personally, we're all going to have times that amygdala is going to be stimulated, that little walnut part of your brain. Now, it's important for us to understand how to deal with that stimulated amygdala and how to focus appropriately. So we don't want to sterilize our training. Now, we talked a couple minutes ago about doing training in a sterile environment and using visualization in that environment. That's totally appropriate. But as I said, that we don't want to cross that into a practical environment. So when I'm talking about sterilizing practical training, we don't want to provide somebody in a situation that's not realistic. And that happens all the time in the fire service. It might just be as simple as, hey, grab that cross lay, do an extension, come to this door, and then providing them some sort of experience that's not really natural. Now, what we're doing in a sterile environment, when we accomplish some of these scenarios and they're not realistic, we're creating these algorithmic processes. We talked about that just a little bit ago, of these, we want these different steps in this order. Now, when we do that, and it's not in a realistic environment, what we're doing is we're training somebody. I have to go through every single one of these processes, and if something happens in the middle here, I got to figure out what to do about that. Now, when your amygdala is stimulated and you have not thrown a ladder in a stressful situation, or taken a hydrant, or pulling a cross lay, when it's done in an environment with a stimulated amygdala, that's where you start to see failures. So it's imperative. Unless we're doing a drill where we're focusing on one specific task, we don't want to sterilize a scenario. We want to make it as realistic as possible to create the biggest value. The first time you have to make a stressful decision, especially if it's something you've not encountered before, I promise you, you don't want to do it during the real event. Now, I've been a trainer, educator, both in the municipal, private, as well as college setting. And the worst group of people to train are usually the veterans, right? In a professional environment, anybody over 5 years, or even in a volunteer department, somebody who's been there for a while. The reason being is because adult learners provide a different challenge. And the reason being is there's varying different types of adult learners that all have low attention spans. Now, there are several types of adult learners. I'll address the 4 most common right now. The first being visual. Now, the visual learner visualizes relationships and ideas. This person wants to see things and be able to take them and break them down. You have an auditory learner. This person learns by listening. I would probably say the least in the fire service, but we can have a lot of auditory learning that occurs from incident debriefs or other people's scenarios they have encountered. The third is a kinesthetic learner. Now, I would absolutely argue that we have the most amount of these. I know I do in our organization because I feel this pressure when I put out too much information that requires reading or other didactic education. Now, the kinesthetic learner learns best by doing it. They want to put their hands on it. They want to experience it. And then from there, they'll achieve learning a lot quicker. And then the fourth is reading and writing. These people read and write and rephrase. And I know I'll classify myself into this position. I'll take what somebody else is saying, and I'll kind of rephrase it, write it down, and make it make more sense for me, and allows me to learn better. Now, all adult learners are the path of least resistance. It's because we got a lot of other things going on. We have our daily schedule, our personal lives, economic impacts, whatever it may be, we have things constantly going through our head because we're not usually put in a situation where we're said, okay, hey, go to this classroom, you're gonna learn. So ultimately, we end up with a low attention span. And you have to deal with how to train an individual with a low attention span. In particular, our industry is full of people with low attention spans. It's because we attract people who are doers, who want to get out in the field, work with their hands, and go at full speed. Sitting in a classroom, that's a little challenging. So how do we deal with low attention spans? Well, when we look at training, we have 2 different types of training in today's world. We have technology-based training, we have practical-based training. And I promise you, death by PowerPoint is metaphorically real. And going to as many trainings that I've gone to, I'm going to tell you right now, firefighters make the worst PowerPoints. They're often cluttered, we got backgrounds, we got noises, things are happening, too many animations, and next thing you know, you don't really know what you're looking at anymore. Then you have the firefighter who stands up and reads a bullet, looks back, reads a bullet, looks back, reads a bullet, looks back. If that's not hypnotizing and makes you want to fall asleep, I don't know what else will. Now, I'm not ragging on technology. It can be a great tool. However, we should use a tool in its place. For example, we don't take a hammer to put a screw into a board. We need to use technology within the context. And oftentimes, it's reducing how much time. Because once again, firefighters learn best by doing. We learn best by having our hands on things and doing physical exertion. Now, at an age where a lot of our training is digital, and we have programs like Target Solutions that are learning management based and records management based, we can send out information through PowerPoint or video ahead of time. Even this right now, this is a technology-based presentation. Now, this is great for quite a few environments. One is pre-course work or filler. If we don't have the resources at the time to put an instructor in a classroom, this is the best thing. If it's sending out information beforehand that allows a student to get some sort of didactic education so we can decrease practical training time and not have to answer so many questions, that also is an empirical benefit. As I said before, a firefighter learns best by doing. And the power of human contact is unreplaceable. Humans like to be in groups. There are very few of us who are hermits that live outside and away from everybody else. We want that contact, and we learn best from that contact. And what we have found is that when we focus too much on technology-based training, the training morale decreases as well as our performance. Ultimately, humans want to learn from other humans. We want to have somebody there, be able to show us, be able to walk us through it, be able to critique us on our technique. Human contact allows us to grab all 4 of those learning styles we talked about earlier and be able to apply it into one. Now, we want to use realistic environments. We want to provide sensory inputs that allows the individual to be in character, to be in role. And we talked about this earlier, that we want to stimulate the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is very easy to stimulate if done properly, and we can do it in kind of crazy, fun, playful ways. When training firefighters in our organization how to deal with the stimulated amygdala, we put them into a scenario that we first told them was going to be a little bit different. Now, what we did is we said, you're going to respond to this house, you're going to go in and do a medical call. This is the medical call, this is probably what you'll experience. But then we also warned them, but we are going to do something that is going to dramatically change the environment. So first of all, their psychological stress starts rising because they know something's going to happen. But we also told them, make the decision that is best suited for you. And that kind of took off the idea that we're going to armchair quarterback them or have any kind of punitive result. Now, when the firefighters went into the area to provide medical care, they're confronted by a bad guy with a gun, who's a trained professional. And that bad guy used lots of explicit words and kept telling them to get out of there. And as we saw, some members kept wanting to approach, provide medical care. Some members took those cues, those body cues, and realized they're in a bad situation. The bad guy pulled out a gun and started firing blanks at the firefighters. And we saw all sorts of responses. We saw everything from people who followed policies and protocols on what to do in an emergency like that. We found people who grew roots and could not make a decision. They didn't fight and they didn't fight. They just kind of froze. And then we saw people who just kind of had all sorts of different human reactions. Now, this is not a fire-based scenario or exercise. What we told people beforehand is that we were going to work on training with your amygdala. And this was a good experience because we knew that not many people have had a gun pointed at them and shot at them. And so what we did is we took firefighters after that and said, look, you're human. And the reactions that you had were human. And we can't necessarily armchair quarterback you because you've never experienced that before. So what we told them from there on out, we are going to start applying certain injections to allow them to understand that their amygdala is ramping up and how to work through that. Now, we avoided training scars in this drill because we told people up front that we were going to provide them in a situation, we're going to put them in a situation that they've never experienced before. Then after we ran through those drills, we told people what the experience should have been, and then we repeated them to avoid those training scars. But the biggest bang for the buck that we did here was just to show people of what can occur if you've never experienced a situation before and your amygdala ramps up and provides that stress. Now, we did this because what we wanted to do is provide an environment where people, one, were safe, but then was also kind of fun. And yes, we did laugh about it afterwards, but we wanted to use this as a gateway into stress-based training and be able to move it into professional or objective-based training for the fire service. Now, you may be asking, how can I do amygdala-based training for a fire-based scenario? And the answer is quite simple. First, you have to inform your members before the drill, scenario, or exercise that you're going to do something that is going to be a little bit out of left field and that you just want them to continue with whatever task you've given them. Second is you provide some sort of inject that just throws that member off guard. Now, you don't want to tell the member specifically what you're going to do. It's just going to be something a little different. Now, this could be as simple as, hey, I want you to take a hydrant going into a structure fire. And then as that person's taking a hydrant, somebody blares by in a police car with its license sirens on. Or you can have somebody screaming, my baby, inside. Now, what's going to happen is that member is going to be thrown off guard by that. And it's going to psychologically induce stress, which allows that amygdala to ramp up. Now, what happens is you've taken that experience and you've set in to the frontal cortex quicker than you would have through repetitious training. Now you have two benefits. One, you've decreased your training time by stimulating the amygdala. And two, you've shown somebody how to work with the stimulated amygdala. And just by doing these small little injects during drills actually provides, one, a fun-based addition, and two, more efficiency. Now, aside from stimulating that amygdala, the other thing we want to do is we want to empower our members to make creative and responsive actions within a framework. Now, oftentimes we want people to act within our drill, but other members going through the exercise, that scenario, may find ways that are simpler and more effective. Now, we need to empower that decision-making process because if we don't, what we're doing is we're training members that they cannot use their creative part of their brain, which ultimately lowers situational awareness. Because oftentimes, trainers, what we do is we expect somebody to accomplish something the way we would do it. So all we're doing are training people to be me. Now, it's not training people to be creative thinkers and be strong within their own skill set. From the training perspective, as long as the individual is doing something within SOP or SOG, we should only be focusing on 3 things. Was it safe, quick, and efficient? So now let's talk about the most important part, training execution. When we execute our training, the first thing we need to focus on is being inclusive. Now, what I mean by that is we need to look at everybody involved and most importantly, the adult learners that we're instructing here. So we want to look at all the common learning types and somehow incorporate that in one training. So things that we should be focusing on are having visual diagrams, communicating processes, and we can include text. Now that text could be while they're in class so they could read along, or it could be just an after drill synopsis. Then lastly, we need to go out and we need to do it to allow those kinesthetic learners to learn best by putting our hands on it. We also want to invite our third-party groups. Now, a third-party group could be as simple as your transporting agency. It could be dispatch. Anybody else who's really involved. I can tell you from my experience, when we involve those people, not only does it develop a better relationship, but allows those people to have more of an understanding of how to accomplish their job while we're accomplishing ours. Now, one experience I had where this was the most beneficial or impactful was we invited dispatchers out to an acquired structure burn. So this is just a training evolution in firefighting. As they came out and they observed, they had no idea that the fire ground was as chaotic as it was. Now for us, we didn't understand that because we're like, well, you're dispatching us and you're managing our radio traffic. What they did is they took from that a better understanding of how to support us in field. Now that ultimately helped that person better with their job as they later relayed to us. And don't forget our law enforcement counterparts. Considering they're our brothers on the line, we want to include them as many training evolutions as we can because not only will this improve relationships, it'll improve on-scene actions. Now the modes of training. How do we execute this training? Now oftentimes, fire service personnel confuse some of the terminology between drill or exercise. But what we need to understand is how to take those concepts and move them forward. So a walkthrough. A walkthrough is a step-by-step demonstration. So a walkthrough is great for imparting new education, could be a new tool, could be a new process, or it could be anything for a rookie. Now a drill is to impart by repetition. A drill would be something like taking a hydrant. We can just do hydrant drills all day long. We can throw packs, that's a drill. As long as it's a step-by-step repetitious part of a process, it's a drill. And then lastly, when we want to exercise, we take those drills and we put them into play. Now an exercise would be like firefighting, responding to an actual fire. Now a drill is looking at specific techniques or certain tasks. An exercise is combining those tasks into one. Now where I'm going with this is that we don't want to be doing drills when we should be doing exercises, and we don't want to be doing exercises when we should be doing drills. When we take things out of sequence, it applies a lot of mental friction, which then can have negative training effect. An example of this would be residential ventilation. We don't want to put a member on a roof the first time that they're asked to cut a hole into a roof. Instead, we want to put them in a training environment where they can first focus on their technique and proper hand placement. After we've accomplished that, then now we can put them into a scenario where they have to get onto the roof and complete an actual residential ventilation. So conversely, sometimes exercises turn into drills because it was just easier for the trainer. And we really want to try to avoid that. When it comes to the delivery of training, one of the simplest things we can do is use co-presenters. And by using co-presenters, we get power in numbers, which is extremely effective. And also students get bored listening to one person. So involving multiple people in the class to kind of have injects keeps shifting the students' focus, allowing them to have more attention. When using co-presenters, it's a good idea to use people across the ranks. So if we're doing something on fire attack, using a firefighter, an apparatus operator, and maybe even a company officer to be involved in the training, it helps disseminate that information and allow that uptake to be a little easier. We want to find ways to keep the students engaged. One of the easiest ways to do this is to ask questions. If we're constantly asking questions during a class, it maintains that focus of students because nobody wants to be called out and to look like the person who doesn't know an answer. So if we constantly keep bouncing things off and do a student-led class, it helps shift that focus. One area that firefighters fail the most is watching the clock. Our presentations go long and they take days. I'm sure some of you have been to classes out there that lasted 7, 8 days. What can you remember from the class? It's probably not a lot. It's because the adult learner's brain shuts off after about 30 minutes. The way to get around this is that you have to keep re-engaging your student, you have to keep shifting the focus, and find entertaining ways to deliver information. And if there's one thing I can say about firefighters teaching presentations, if your material's boring or uncredible, you lost everything. So we can jump around through different modes. We can do a little bit of hands-on, a little bit of class, show some diagrams, listen to some audio, find different ways to involve all the adult learner styles into one class. And if you can do that through a cycle, you'll maintain focus of your entire classroom a lot longer. When we're doing the training, we want to do it right, and we want to do it right from the beginning. First part of that is planning out your variables. If you have a variable in your drill, like you think a firefighter might go a certain way, then have a plan for that, because you can't necessarily tell a student, oh, you can't do that, or hey, let's pretend something. If you fear a student might breach a wall to get out of somewhere a lot quicker, then have a plan for that. And maybe it's just a little bit more energy on the trainer's side to be able to create a prop that allows for that, and so we can replace that wall pretty quickly before the next evolution. Because ultimately, we want creative thinkers. Everybody has a vast degree of knowledge and skill set. Let's allow people to utilize that, because we're not rats in a maze. And unfortunately, in a lot of fire service training, that's exactly what we do. Okay, I need you to follow this, do this, and then accomplish this task. Now, if we don't allow people to be creative, they never will be on a scene, then ultimately we come back and armchair quarterback them. Well, why didn't you do that? When we're training, we're actively programming the human brain and inspiring human performance. Going back to my lab rat comment, we are all programmable. Brainwashing is very simple. We need to stop training that leads to incorrect synapse development. Find those areas out before a drill. This takes a lot of pre-planning. Find all those variables, find the things that might be coming, that rat going into a maze, and ensure that they don't happen. Now, we've all experienced this on some sort of training, where you have a trainer who's got a great knowledge set, but doesn't necessarily understand how to instruct it. So instead, either if it's a drill or an exercise and they get confused, what happens is the individuals who are participating can't accomplish it the way that the person has it in their head. Now, this person or this trainer could prevent this ahead of time by laying out the exercise a little bit simpler and allowing people to have creative thought processes. As trainers, it's our job to provide the sandbox. So what we want to do is make it realistic, and we also want to train as we play. Allow the people within a framework to execute the objective the way it would normally be done on an incident scene. Another thing that we do in the fire services quite frequently is front loading. Now, front loading is the act of putting the right people, resources, or equipment in place prior to a scenario. And the reason why we're doing that is either consciously or subconsciously, we're trying to make something work. An example of this would be an interior fire attack. If the engine itself automatically appears with a backup engine and the hose lines are already laid out, then all the firefighter has to do is grab the hose and then make the interior fire attack. What's occurring is that we're losing everything else beforehand. How did that hose play out? How did that engine get there? How did the resources get dispatched appropriately? Now, if we don't train start to finish, what happens is if we don't know how to do the things in between, the end result will never come into fruition because it won't even happen. Front loading is natural, but it's also horribly ineffective. And the reason being is because trainers want to be successful. We want a drill to come across looking like it was a golden nugget. Now, if we're not careful and we don't realize that we may be front loading when we actually are, all we're doing is creating training scars and also not making it realistic. To get around this, we need people to be allowed to solve problems. Sometimes things go a little sideways. If we don't see how it plays out, we may never know there's actually a problem. However, if things are going sideways and we realize that we could be creating training scars or a negative neural pathway, we need to call an all stop, let everybody be very present of what's occurring, and then train on that right thing to get out of that rut. So what are training scars? Well, I'm going to tell you right now that training scars are very prevalent in the fire service. What they are is a bad habit or a negative perception based upon bad training. And there are tons of examples out there. One knowledge-based example is fire doubles every minute. How many decades were firefighters taught that fire doubles every minute, when in fact, it never actually did? It was just bad training that was done on TV. Another example is the Coriolis effect. We, for some reason, taught firefighters for decades that there was a correlation between flushing a toilet and how fire stream patterns worked. Now, as much as where we're at in the hemisphere, it does not affect our fire streams, so we can get past that now. Another practical example is forcible entry. How many times have we seen people who just have bonkered ideas of how to create entry into a building through improper technique? Now, where I'm going with this is that sometimes traditional training may hamper our progressiveness. That we have to have a full understanding of what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, and if it's contextually correct. And lastly, we need to ensure our training ground has a very positive morale, because without it, we start seeing negative bias. Now, this is the role of the trainer, is before executing training, look in, research, understand why something is the way it is. Asking why may be the best question we ever can, because it will tell us what the end result should be. Now, for the rookie, it's probably a good time to just keep our ears open and our mouth shut unless there's a safety hazard. So what makes a training scar? If we look at the negative or inefficient skill, the list can grow kind of long, but some examples are incorrect training information or material, front loading, lack of realism, poor attitude, hiding mistakes, or lack of self-actualization. Looking at the negative emotion or just negative perception of training in general, the list, some of the examples would be the training instructor, master of all mentality. Now, unfortunately, this happens a lot because whoever's instructing generally, for some reason, has a belief that they know everything, which is incorrect. Set up for failure, that we set people up to have them fail. Negative debriefs, telling everybody, what they should have done. Poor attitudes, hiding mistakes, then a lack of self-actualization. Debriefing. Debriefing is very important after every drill or scenario that we do. The reason being is because we can grab so much training information from it, and if it's multi-company, we can grab the training information that we didn't even experience from somebody else. However, when we debrief, it needs to be done kind of under two different mindsets. Is this one, initial training, for example, like rookie or recruit training? Or second, is this just continuing ed training that we do with our veteran members? So when we're doing recruit or rookie-based training, the first thing is review the drill or the exercise. We actually want to go through, okay, what actually occurred here? What did you do? What did you see? What did you experience? After we've done that, we determine what was good and what was bad. Now for a rookie, it's probably the best beneficial for us to tell that rookie right away, hey, we didn't like this, I want you to do this again. The reason being is rookies at this point, what we're doing is we're training them. We're programming them to our expectations. And sometimes that requires a lot more content or expression. Next, we want to relate anything that happened on that drill or that exercise to any kind of SOP or SOGs. The reason being is by cross-referencing it, that person will have a better understanding of policy or procedure for the organization, but as well how it applies to this specific task. And lastly, we want to repeat it, if applicable. We always want to repeat anytime there was a training error that we want to train out of somebody. And we want to end training on a good note. If we don't, we start creating those training scars. Next, let's discuss debriefing for the veterans of our organization. The first is we want to review the drill or exercise. When we review it, we want the members who took part of it to lead that. All we want to be as trainers is to host it, but allow them to actually lead it, because the biggest thing is we want them to say what was good and what was bad. This creates self-actualization. And by doing this, it allows the crews to drive future trainings and for us to understand if our training worked or it did not work. If the crews do not find kind of errors in their own methods and we can't lead them towards that, we can suggest or recommend corrections. when we do that, it should be very minimal, because there's nothing worse than going to a drill and having a officer or chief officer sit there and tell everybody what they should have done. And everybody's brains turns off and we stop listening. And lastly, if applicable, repeat it. Now, sometimes we don't have the opportunity to end a drill on a good note due to calls, training, daily schedule, but if we should always end training on a positive note. And if it has to be only through conversation, then it be's. Safety is a very important topic when it comes to training. And it's very hard to find a harmonious balance between being either too safe or not being safe enough. But ultimately, we should strive to prevent training ground injuries. Now, sometimes that's hard because injuries are just going to occur, but it's our job as trainers to show that we tried to prevent that. So what's hurting us? Now, when you look at that, there's two different subjects. Either it's acute or it's chronic. Chronic exposure in our industry is very bad, and we're seeing that through unnecessary firefighter cancer rates. And the acute injuries are also very bad. We just need to find ways to limit them. So some of them, hazardous exposure. Hazardous exposure, we should always ensure people are wearing the right PPE for the right scenario. Now, even when it comes to live fire acquired structure burns, it's important that we're rotating our people who are interior, for example, interior safety or torch. We're rotating those people quite frequently, because some of the data out there is showing that carbon monoxide is absorbing through our gear and through our skin. An increase of carbon monoxide, they have found, increases the risk of cancer. A lack of a comprehensive physical fitness and education program is also hurting us. On the training ground, we see a lot of strains and we see a lot of sprains. Both of these should be preventable. However, there is going to be a certain percentage that you're just not going to be able to do. Forcible entry is a great example. If we can find ways to stretch and to loosen our muscles up before we engage in a forcible entry and using the right core muscles, we should be able to limit those. However, there are going to be the freak accidents that we can't avoid. Nonetheless, that's why physical fitness should be a priority for a firefighter to avoid these types of injuries. Repetitious injuries hurt us all the time. Our bodies are not designed to go through the same movement over and over and over again without some sort of break or change. When it comes to recruit training, our organization does a lot of push-ups kind of as penalty. Now, if we're doing 300 push-ups right in a row, over a period of time, we're going to start seeing elbows blow out and rotator cuff issues. We have to find ways to change things up. Take breaks, stretch, find different ways of getting through a task. And lastly, incorrect or inadequate training. If we're training people incorrectly and not thinking about proper technique, proper body positioning, proper muscle groups, all of this will eventually lead to an injury on the drill ground. The answer is very simple. When you're designing training, look ahead and try to find these areas that could be potential pinch points of hurting people. Then put systems in place to prevent that. Anytime there's a risk of an immediately dangerous to life and health environment, or you have a high risk liability, we should always put a safety officer in place. The safety officer should never be hands-on. Now, this goes against human instinct that we always want to put our hands on things and do, but we always have to make sure that we remind our safety officers to stand back and purely be observers. Now, a safety officer should be the most qualified individual to be in that position. Doesn't necessarily need to be a training officer. It could even be a firefighter if that's something the firefighter is skilled at or a subject of expertise. However, during a safety officer's observation, if they find any critical issue, they should stop or prevent something from occurring. If you're thinking about assigning a safety officer, you should really be thinking about an IAP or an incident action plan. If there's a possibility of hurting somebody, it won't hurt to lay everything out and create a plan for the entire drill or exercise. To conclude this presentation, training is the most important thing we can do as fire service personnel. Regardless if you're a rookie or a 30-year veteran, there's always something to learn. Our organization is always changing. As trainers, we need to be progressive, be ahead of this, understand the way humans think, and be able to train them according to how they think. When we develop training, think about all the variables out there. Allow members of your organization to be creative thinkers within a framework set forth by the organization. And lastly, this is not your father's fire service. Let's take things that are imperative of our tradition, but let's really be critical and crucial of how we move forward and be progressive. Because if tradition hampers us, we'll never be able to be as effective as we want to be.